Max was a loyal companion. For 12 years, he had been the heart of the Carlson family. He was more than just a dog. He was a protector, a confidant, and a constant presence in the life of every member of the household. His sleek black and tan coat had been a familiar sight, gliding through the yard or resting by the door, waiting for the family to return home. But as time passed, life for the Carlsons began to change in ways they could never have anticipated. Gary Carlson, the patriarch, had always been a hard-working man. He had worked at a local construction company for over 20 years, providing for his family. But a few years ago, his health began to decline. Heart problems and chronic pain became a constant burden. With his medical bills piling up and his ability to work severely reduced, the financial strain became unbearable. The once bustling house now echoed with quiet desperation, and Gary, once so full of life, spent more and more time in bed, unable to engage with his children, or with Max as he used to. Jennifer, Gary's wife, tried to keep things together. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, but with 2 kids to care for and a husband in declining health, she was stretched thin. Her heart broke seeing Gary struggle, but even more so when she saw Max slowly losing his spark. He no longer played fetch with the kids or greeted Gary with his usual enthusiasm when he came home from work. Max, too, had aged. His fur was graying at the muzzle. His steps were slower, and his once joyful bark was now subdued. When Gary's condition worsened, and the family fell behind on their bills, Jennifer was forced to make a difficult decision. She couldn't afford the pet insurance anymore, and Max, despite all the love and care he had given them over the years, was now seen as an additional burden. With a heavy heart, Jennifer made the call to the local animal shelter. She explained the situation, how their beloved German Shepherd, who had been part of their family for more than a decade, needed to be surrendered. The shelter, called Willow Creek Animal Rescue, was located about 20 miles outside of town. It was a no-kill shelter, which meant that Max wouldn't face the harsh reality of being put down right away. Still, Jennifer knew this was the end of an era for her family. She took Max in the car for what would be his final ride with the Carlsons. The kids were at school and Gary was too ill to come. The goodbye was quiet, with Jennifer's tears mixing with Max's soft whines as they reached the shelter gates. When Jennifer opened the door of the car, Max hesitated, his ears drooping and eyes cast down, as if he understood that this was no longer a familiar place. He looked back at her, once more searching for reassurance, but she couldn't offer it. With a final pat on his head, Jennifer watched as a shelter worker took Max's leash and led him inside. She didn't look back as she drove away, but the ache in her chest would never leave. Inside Willow Creek, Max was placed in a small, dimly lit kennel. The walls were painted a faded yellow, and the scent of disinfectant mixed with the underlying smell of despair. Max curled up in the corner, his eyes glazed, as if he had already given up on everything. The workers at Willow Creek, led by Claire, a volunteer who had been with the shelter for years, were accustomed to seeing dogs in distress. But even Claire couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness as she watched Max lie there, motionless. His once proud posture was now defeated. He barely ate, and his eyes never brightened when anyone approached his cage. Claire knew what this meant. Max, a 12-year-old German Shepherd, was nearing the end of his life, and no one wanted to adopt a senior dog. The reality was that he was a candidate for euthanasia, the shelter's staff silently preparing for the worst. Yet, despite the staff's grim expectations, Claire continued to offer him comfort. She spoke to him softly every day, but Max didn't respond. His body had grown frail, and his spirit seemed to have withered with the passing days. It seemed like he was waiting for something, or perhaps waiting for nothing at all. Claire had seen many dogs come and go, but something about Max's eyes left a lasting impression. There was a sadness there that words could not express. She often found herself pausing by his kennel, hoping to see even a glimmer of the loyal dog he had once been. But each time it was the same. He lay motionless, as though his heart had already left Willow Creek. In the midst of this, a regular event at the shelter was about to change everything. On the morning of the 5th day after Max had been surrendered, Willow Creek Animal Rescue was unusually busy. The shelter was hosting a small event for the local community, an adoption day for potential pet owners. Families with children, young couples, and even some elderly visitors strolled through the doors, looking for the next furry companion to join their homes. The staff was doing their best to keep the mood upbeat, hoping that some of the dogs might find their forever families that day. Claire walked down the rows of kennels, greeting the visitors with a smile, all while keeping an eye on the dogs. Some were playful and energetic, others shy but hopeful, and a few, like Max, were simply resigned to their fate. Max remained curled up in his corner. The others in the shelter were excited, wagging their tails and barking in greeting to each visitor who passed. But Max, he didn't move. He barely even looked up anymore. His ribs were visible, and his coat had lost its shine. Claire had taken to calling him the quiet one, since no one ever seemed to notice him among the younger, more enthusiastic dogs. Even in a shelter full of animals in need of love, Max's heart seemed closed off from the world. It seemed as if he had already given up. That afternoon, a small family entered the shelter, a couple with 2 children. The youngest, a little girl no older than 6 or 7, tugged at her mother's sleeve with excitement. "Mommy, look, puppies!" she exclaimed, pointing at the rows of energetic dogs barking eagerly at the visitors. Her name was Emma, a curious and empathetic child who loved animals more than anything in the world. She had been begging her parents to adopt a dog for months, her little heart set on bringing a dog into their home. She had seen the flyer at school about Willow Creek's adoption event and convinced her parents to come along. Her father, Matt, and her mother, Susan, both smiled at Emma's enthusiasm. They loved their daughter deeply and were open to the idea of getting a dog. But they were cautious. They had discussed it many times before. They had a yard, but they didn't know what kind of dog would be best for their family. As they walked past the younger dogs, Emma's attention was suddenly drawn to the back corner of the shelter. There, in the dim light, she spotted a large German shepherd curled up, his head resting on his paws. His eyes were dull, and he didn't even acknowledge their presence. "Mommy, what about him?" Emma asked softly, pointing at Max, her voice gentle and curious. Susan paused, looking at Max with some hesitation. The dog was clearly older, and he didn't seem as lively as the other dogs. She glanced at Claire, who was standing nearby. "He's a little older," Claire explained quietly, noticing the direction of their gaze. "Max has been here for a while. He's had a tough time adjusting. He's about 12 years old, and he doesn't have the same energy as some of the younger dogs." Emma didn't seem to mind. She took a few steps closer to Max's kennel, her small hand reaching out to the bars, her eyes locked on the dog with an unspoken understanding. She could sense that he was sad, and the sadness tugged at her heart. "Hi there," she said softly, her voice clear and warm, yet gentle. "I'm Emma. My family's here to find a dog. Do you want to come home with me?" Max didn't respond right away, but there was something about Emma's voice, something in the way she spoke, that broke through the wall of silence that had surrounded him for so long. It was almost as if her voice, so soft and unassuming, reminded him of someone he had known in the past, perhaps a voice from the days when his family had been whole. For a moment, he lifted his head, his tired eyes locking onto hers. He didn't bark or wag his tail, but his gaze softened, and there was a flicker of something familiar in his tired eyes. Emma, sensing that her presence had made a small impact, knelt down next to the cage, her hand still reaching out. "You're so pretty," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't have to be alone anymore." It was as if her words had reached him in a way nothing else had in days. For the first time since arriving at Willow Creek, Max stood up. Slowly, with effort, he shuffled to the front of the kennel, leaning his body against the bars. His tail twitched, and his ears perked up just a little. It was a small movement, but it was enough to capture the attention of the shelter staff. Claire watched wide-eyed. She had never seen Max react like this. Even when she had tried to comfort him, he had been distant, withdrawn. But now something had changed. It was as if Emma's gentle words had sparked a light in him, something that had been buried deep inside, something that longed for connection once more. Emma, her heart full of compassion, smiled at the dog. "Do you want to come home with us?" she repeated, her voice filled with warmth. The moment felt like magic. Max, who had been a shadow of himself just moments before, now seemed to be listening, considering the possibility of a new beginning. The moments that followed felt like a dream to Emma. As she knelt in front of Max's cage, her little hands still resting on the bars, she felt a warmth spreading through her chest. The sadness she had noticed in his eyes earlier seemed to lift, just a little. Max's tired gaze, once hollow and resigned, now showed the faintest spark of curiosity. Claire, standing nearby, exchanged a glance with Susan and Matt. It wasn't just Emma's gentle words that had made a difference. It was the way Max was responding. He was still weak, still not the energetic dog he once must have been. But there was a shift in him. For the first time in days, he was engaging, even if just a little. "He doesn't usually act this way," Claire said, her voice soft, almost in disbelief. "Max has been here for a while, and he's been withdrawn. But I think he's starting to trust you." Emma's mother, Susan, was quiet for a moment, watching her daughter with the dog. Her husband, Matt, stood next to her, his brow furrowed as he considered the situation. They had discussed getting a dog, but they hadn't planned on adopting one quite like this. They were prepared for a playful puppy, one that would bring energy and joy to their home. Max, however, was a different story. He was older, quieter, and had been through things they couldn't even imagine. Matt, always practical, spoke up. "He's an older dog," he said cautiously, looking at Claire. "Do you think he's healthy enough to adopt?" Claire paused for a moment, considering the question. She knew that Max wasn't in perfect health. His body showed the signs of his age, and there were subtle signs of his past struggles, but he was far from being in immediate danger. Max had just needed time and patience, things he hadn't had since arriving at Willow Creek. The gentle nature of Emma's approach had brought something out of him that hadn't been there in days. "He's been through a lot, but he's not beyond help," Claire answered finally, her voice steady. "He'll need some care, but he's still got some good years left. With the right environment, I think he could thrive again." Susan and Matt exchanged a glance. They could see the connection between Emma and Max, and despite their reservations, they both knew that adopting a dog, especially one like Max, would require patience, understanding, and a commitment they weren't sure they were ready for. But the bond they had witnessed between Emma and Max in just a few minutes was undeniable. "I think he might be the one," Susan said quietly, her voice filled with both hope and uncertainty. "Maybe he just needs someone to love him again." Matt nodded slowly. "It's going to take a lot of work, but we'll make it work. If Emma feels this strongly about him, I think it's worth trying." Max, still leaning against the bars of the kennel, gave a small, quiet whimper. His eyes had softened even more, and his tail, though barely moving, wagged ever so slightly. The family stood there for a few moments in silence, watching the old dog as he silently reached out, asking for something he hadn't allowed himself to hope for in a long time: belonging. Emma, her heart filled with determination, stood up slowly and turned to Claire. "Can we take him home with us?" she asked, her voice unwavering. "He's going to be a part of our family. I know it." Claire, her heart touched by the sincerity in Emma's voice, smiled gently. "Of course, sweetie. Let me go get the paperwork ready." The family stood together, watching as Claire went to gather the adoption papers. Emma's eyes never left Max as he slowly rose to his feet and padded to the front of the cage. His tired eyes now filled with something different, something that resembled hope. Max had been given a second chance, and for the first time in a long while, he seemed to believe it. Susan and Matt took a deep breath, looking at each other once more. This was it. They had made the decision. They were taking Max home. As Claire returned with the necessary forms, the family completed the paperwork, and within minutes, Max was officially a part of their family. Susan gently took his leash, and Max, with his head held just a little higher, walked out of the kennel. Emma stood by his side, her hands still resting on his back as they made their way to the car. We're going to be best friends, Max, she whispered, her voice full of warmth and conviction. I'll take care of you. You'll see. For the first time in what felt like forever, Max lifted his head and walked with purpose, following Emma to his new life. The ride back to Emma's home was a quiet one, filled with the soft hum of the car's engine and the occasional whisper of excitement from Emma in the back seat. She sat beside Max, her hand resting gently on his back, offering him the comfort of her presence. Max, who had been so still and withdrawn just hours earlier, now seemed to draw strength from the little girl beside him. His breathing had steadied, and his gaze, though tired, had softened. He was beginning to trust again, just as Emma had promised. Emma's parents, Susan and Matt, exchanged glances in the front seat. They had never expected this quiet, solemn dog joining their family. They had imagined a more typical adoption experience. A lively puppy bouncing around, tail wagging uncontrollably. But Max wasn't like that. He was calm, thoughtful, and carried the weight of his past in every step. Yet, despite his age and his history, there was a new sense of peace in the car. Emma's excitement was palpable, and Max, despite his quiet demeanor, seemed to be accepting the change. When they finally arrived home, Emma's older brother, Josh, was already outside, playing in the yard. He was 14, and though he'd always liked dogs, he wasn't as immediately smitten as his little sister had been. He looked up when the car pulled into the driveway, his attention shifting to the large German shepherd stepping out of the car. "Is that him?" Josh asked, his voice filled with curiosity as he walked over to meet Max. Emma nodded enthusiastically, rushing over to Max's side. "Yes, it's Max. He's going to be part of our family now." Max, despite the new surroundings, seemed to settle in quickly. He sniffed around the yard, his nose twitching as he took in the sense of his new home. He was no longer in the shelter, no longer in a cage. The wide open space and the fresh air seemed to revive him a little, though he remained reserved. Still, his body language had changed. The slight wag of his tail, the soft, steady gaze he gave Emma as she stood by his side. It was all an unspoken promise that he was starting to find his place again. Josh crouched down in front of Max, eyeing the older dog carefully. "Hey, Max," he said softly, reaching out a hand. "Welcome home." Max hesitated for a moment, unsure, but then, slowly, he took a few steps forward and sniffed Josh's hand. His tail gave a slow, tentative wag. Josh smiled. He wasn't sure what to expect from Max, but it was clear that the dog wasn't aggressive, and that was a relief. With time, he knew the bond between Max and the family would grow. Inside the house, Susan prepared a spot for Max by the front door, where he could rest comfortably. It wasn't a luxurious bed, but it was a soft, safe place where he could feel secure. She placed a water bowl down and gently coaxed Max toward it. At first, he didn't seem interested, but when he caught a whiff of the fresh water, his thirst took over. Slowly, Max drank deeply, savoring the cool liquid. Susan stood back, watching him, her heart swelling with affection. She had never thought they'd adopt an older dog, but now, she couldn't imagine their home without him. Later that evening, after dinner, the family sat down in the living room. Max had settled on his new bed near the window, his eyes following the family members as they moved around the room. He wasn't yet part of the action. He hadn't curled up by the couch or playfully approached the children, but he was no longer completely withdrawn. He was learning to trust again, taking in the sights and sounds of this new, quieter life. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, close enough to Max to offer him comfort if he needed it. She looked at him, her eyes full of determination. "I know you're tired, Max," she said gently, as if speaking to an old friend. "But I'm going to make sure you're happy here. You'll see. We're going to have lots of fun together." Max looked at her, and for the first time since arriving in his new home, he wagged his tail, slowly, but with a sense of purpose. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to Emma. She smiled widely, her heart bursting with joy. She was so sure that this was the beginning of something beautiful. The next few days were filled with routine and adjustment. Max was hesitant at first, not used to the sounds of a busy household. The loud footsteps of the children running upstairs, the sound of the television in the evening. It all felt like a new world to him. But each day, he grew more accustomed to the rhythms of his new life. And each day, he grew a little stronger. Emma spent hours with him in the yard, throwing a ball for him to chase. Even though Max didn't always bring it back, she didn't mind. She knew that he had his own pace, his own way of doing things. Some days, Max would just sit in the yard, staring out into the distance, as if remembering something. But other days, he would stand up, wag his tail, and walk with Emma around the garden. His movements were slow, but there was a quiet pride in the way he carried himself. Susan and Matt kept a watchful eye, ensuring that Max was comfortable and that his needs were met. They knew there would be challenges ahead. Max's age meant that he would need special care, and there would be moments of difficulty as they adjusted to life with a senior dog. But they were ready. They had seen the way Max had responded to Emma's kindness, and they knew that this old German shepherd still had a lot of love to give. As the days turned into weeks, the bond between Max and the family grew stronger. Max, the quiet and withdrawn dog they had once found in the shelter, was no longer the same. He had found his place in the Carlson family, not as a puppy to be pampered and played with, but as a steady, loving companion who brought peace and comfort to everyone around him. And Emma, with her gentle words and unwavering faith, had given him a second chance at a life full of love. The weeks passed by in a blur of change, small moments that seemed insignificant but were actually the foundation of something lasting. Max was no longer the same dog who had been left in the corner of the shelter, his spirit dimmed by years of neglect and uncertainty. He had found a new rhythm in the Carlson family's home, a quiet one, but one full of tenderness and care. Emma continued to be his rock, her bond with him growing stronger every day. She spent hours in the yard with him, her laughter ringing through the air whenever he would join her for slow walks around the garden. At first, Max had been hesitant, unsure of how to navigate this new life. But with Emma's gentle encouragement, he started to open up, a little more each day. He would follow her into the yard, his movements still slow, but now with purpose. And sometimes, just sometimes, he would even chase after the ball she threw, though he never quite brought it back. Emma's family watched the transformation with quiet amazement. They had seen how distant Max had been when he first arrived, how little interest he showed in the world around him. But now they saw the small changes. The way he would lay at the foot of the stairs, waiting for Emma to come down, or how he would curl up next to her on the couch in the evenings. There was a contentment in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was no longer the sad, withdrawn dog they had met at the shelter. Max had found a sense of belonging. Josh, though a little more reserved in his affections for Max, had warmed to him as well. He had always been a dog lover, but he had been cautious about adopting an older dog. Would Max be able to keep up with the energy of a family with young children? Would he be too set in his ways to bond with them? But as the weeks passed, Josh noticed something that made him believe Max was exactly what their family needed. The way the dog would lie next to Emma while she read, the quiet comfort he provided when the family watched movies together. Max had found his place, and he was happy to be there. One evening, as the family sat in the living room, the warmth of the fire crackling in the background, they all felt the peace that had settled over their home. Max was sprawled out on his bed by the door, his breathing steady and calm, his eyes half closed as he listened to the sounds of the family around him. For a moment, everything felt perfect. The family had healed together, and Max had become a part of their story. No longer just the quiet dog from the shelter, but a loved member of the family. Emma, who had been sitting on the floor playing with Max, looked up at her parents. "Can we keep him forever?" she asked, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. She had never questioned it. Max was already her best friend, and she couldn't imagine a life without him. Susan smiled softly, glancing at Matt before she answered. "Yes, sweetie, we can keep him forever." Emma's eyes lit up, and she threw her arms around Max, hugging him tightly. The old dog's ears perked up, and he leaned into her embrace, his tail thumping softly against the floor. In that moment, It was as though Max understood what Emma had just asked, and that he, too, had found his forever home. He had found a place where he was wanted, where he was loved, and where his past no longer defined him. It wasn't just the home that had changed for Max. It was the family, too. They had come together not just to adopt a dog, but to give an old soul a second chance. They had taken on the responsibility of caring for an older dog, one who had seen his fair share of hardship, and in return, they had been given a loyalty that no one could ever replace. The family had learned to slow down, to appreciate the simple moments, and to understand that love could come in many forms. Max, in his quiet way, had taught them that. Over the following months, the family watched as Max's health improved, though it was clear that age would always be a factor. He wasn't the same dog who had once been full of energy, but his steady presence filled their home in ways that no one had expected. He no longer spent his days lying in the corner, withdrawn and disconnected. Instead, he followed Emma around the house, offering a comforting presence whenever she needed it. At night, he would sleep beside her, as though keeping guard over her while she dreamed. There were still moments when he seemed to reflect on something, some distant memory of a time long past. But when Emma would call his name or rest her head against his fur, he would lift his head and give her a soft nuzzle, as though reminding himself that this, here and now, was where he belonged. The Carlson family had made the right decision that day in the shelter. Max had brought them closer together, reminding them of the power of compassion and the importance of second chances. He had gone from being a dog on the verge of being forgotten to becoming an irreplaceable part of their family. And for Emma, who had given him that chance with her gentle heart, Max was more than just a dog. He was a reminder of the kindness that could be found in the world, even in the most unexpected places. And for Max, every soft pat on the head, every slow walk through the yard, every gentle word spoken in his ear, was a sign that his story had only just begun. They were home now together, Emma, Max, and the whole Carlson family, living a life filled with love, patience, and quiet joy.